Lonely rancher saved a shot woman in thigh. Next day, a gang came finding her. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The gunshot split the Montana dawn like a thunderclap, scattering a flock of crows into the pale sky. Clara Dawson stumbled through the tall grass, one hand pressed desperately against her thigh as blood seeped through the fabric of her traveling skirt. Her golden hair tumbled loose from its pins, framing a face pale with exhaustion. She had been running for 3 days, running from the horrors of the Stagecoach massacre, from the men who had slaughtered without mercy, and from the memory of their laughter as the smoke cleared. Her legs finally gave way beneath her, and she collapsed against the gnarled trunk of a weathered cottonwood tree. The bark pressed cold against her back, rough enough to remind her she was still alive, though just barely. Each shallow breath scraped her lungs. Her vision blurred at the edges. In the stillness of the prairie, she could hear her own heartbeat thundering louder than the gunshot that had nearly ended her life. She looked up at the endless Montana sky, so wide, so merciless, so empty. And for a fleeting moment, Clara wondered if God had brought her here to die. A verse her mother once whispered at her sickbed long ago floated through her memory. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." Perhaps, she thought with fading consciousness, he was near even now. Hoofbeats broke the silence. Her heart clenched. She clawed weakly at the small pistol still tucked in her waistband, though her hand trembled too badly to draw it. Through the haze, she glimpsed a tall figure dismounting from a chestnut stallion. A wide-brimmed hat shaded his face, but she caught the glint of a badge pinned to his vest. "Easy there," the man's voice rumbled, low and steady, as if carved from bedrock. "You're hurt bad, miss." "Stay back," Clara rasped, though her voice cracked under the weight of thirst and fear. "I have a gun." "And I have water," he answered gently, holding up a canteen and a steady hand for patching bullet wounds. The morning sun caught his features at last, weathered skin bronzed by years beneath the open sky, gray streaks at his temples, eyes the color of storm clouds. Not the eyes of a predator, but of a man who had seen too much loss. He knelt, careful not to crowd her, and tipped his hat. "Name's James Caldwell, sheriff of Willow Creek. You'll not last another hour out here alone. May I look at that wound?" Clara's breath hitched. For days she had trusted no one, certain that any kindness would be a trick. Yet something in his tone, plain, unhurried, sincere, slipped past her defenses. She swallowed hard, her strength ebbing fast. They'll come for me," she whispered. "Then we best get you somewhere safe before they do," he replied. His gaze softened and his voice lowered to something almost like a vow. No one should face this pain alone. Her vision swam, her grip on the pistol slackened. At last, Clara gave a faint nod, surrendering not just to exhaustion, but to the possibility that Providence had sent her help in the form of this weary sheriff. Sheriff James Caldwell wasted no time. With the care of a man who had lifted too many broken bodies from battlefields, he slid one arm beneath Clara's shoulders and the other under her knees. She winced as he rose, a gasp torn from her throat, but his stride was steady, his chest broad and warm against her cheek. The chestnut stallion shifted uneasily as James approached. "Easy, Barlow," he murmured to the horse. "She's light as kindling. You can bear us both." With practiced ease, he mounted and settled Clara in front of him, one arm braced firmly around her to keep her steady. The prairie rolled endlessly before them, golden grass rippling like waves beneath the morning wind. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, dimly aware of the rhythmic thud of hooves, the creak of leather, and the steady heartbeat she felt through the sheriff's shirt. Each time her eyes fluttered open, she found herself listening to his voice, low and reassuring, as he spoke to his horse, as if words alone could will them all forward. After what felt like an eternity, a shape emerged through the trees, a small log cabin tucked at the edge of the timberline. Smoke still curled from the chimney, the scent of pine resin and last night's fire mingling in the crisp air. To Clara's blurred eyes, it looked less like a home and more like a miracle. James dismounted carefully, then carried her inside. The cabin was plain but tidy. Walls of rough-hewn logs, a narrow bed covered with a patchwork quilt, a small iron stove still radiating warmth. On a shelf by the window rested a row of well-thumbed books, beside which sat a weathered Bible, its cover worn by years of use. He set her gently on the bed, then moved briskly to light a lantern and fetch clean cloths. His hands moved with the precision of long practice. She noticed the scars on his forearms when he rolled back his sleeves, pale reminders of some long-ago battlefield. "You've lost too much blood," he said, his voice calm but clipped. He poured water from a jug into a basin. "That bullet's lodged deep. I can get it out, but it won't be pleasant." Clara forced her eyes open. Who taught you?" "War," he answered simply. "I was a medic with the Union. Saw more wounds than any man should." A tremor of fear passed through her, but so did an odd comfort. This was not the first life he'd tried to save. Perhaps God had trained his hands for this very moment. He placed a folded strip of leather by her hand. "Bite if you must, and if you need to scream, don't hold back. No one but the trees will hear." Clara swallowed, tasting copper where she had bitten her lip earlier. She wanted to argue, to insist she could endure it, but her strength had all but drained away. With a faint nod, she surrendered once more. James bent close, his storm-gray eyes steady. "Hold fast, Miss Dawson. You're not alone anymore." And as the lamplight flickered across the cabin walls, Clara felt, for the first time in days, that perhaps she was not abandoned to the wilderness after all. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments. Clara woke to the crackle of firewood and the faint aroma of coffee. For a moment she thought she had dreamed the horrors of the stagecoach attack, that the blood, the screams, the endless running were nightmares conjured by an exhausted mind. But then her leg throbbed sharply, reminding her of the wound that had nearly claimed her life. Sheriff James Caldwell sat at a rough-hewn table nearby, his broad frame bent over a battered Bible. His lips moved silently as though he were weighing words he did not often speak aloud. When he noticed her stirring, he closed the book with a care that suggested reverence rather than habit. "You're awake," he said, his voice still low, steady as a mountain stream. "That's a good sign." Clara shifted against the quilt, wincing. "It still hurts." "It will, for a while." He poured hot water into a tin cup and brought it to her, careful not to crowd her space. "But you'll heal. I've seen worse." His words were plain, but the quiet conviction in them lent her a strength she had thought gone. Over the next days, her strength returned in small increments. Each step with the aid of a cane was a battle. Each attempt to lift a spoon without trembling felt like victory. James kept the fire going, prepared simple meals: cornbread, rabbit stew, thick slices of salt pork, and though she ate little, it was enough to remind her that life could continue. Evenings brought a different rhythm. When the chores were done and silence hung heavy outside the cabin walls, James would set a small carved checkerboard between them. Clara at first hesitated, then allowed herself the faint smile of competition as she moved a piece. Their games were quiet affairs, punctuated by the scrape of wood on wood, by the occasional grunt when James found his piece cornered. On the third evening, Clara noticed the shelf by the stove. A scattering of worn books, spines cracked from use. She rose gingerly and traced their edges with her fingers. Shakespeare, Dickens, and the Bible, older than the rest, its leather faded smooth. "You read all of these?" she asked. "When winter nights run long and the wind howls through the cracks," he answered. "Words can keep a man company when nothing else will." Clara returned to her chair, her eyes thoughtful. "My parents kept books too, until the influenza took them. She swallowed, her voice softening. I was 22, alone in Boston, no family left. Teaching seemed the only way to build something lasting. James's jaw tightened. He stared into the fire before speaking. I had a wife once, and a little girl. 8 years ago, a stagecoach robbery took 'em from me while I was busy being sheriff in a town that didn't need one. The silence that followed was not empty, but heavy with shared loss. Clara felt it settle around them like the quilt on her lap, sorrow stitched with resilience. Perhaps that's why we're both here, she murmured, running from memories, looking for something more. For the first time since she had met him, James allowed himself the barest smile, brief and almost reluctant. Maybe so. And in that fragile exchange, Clara sensed the first thread of trust weaving between them. Not just the bond of survival, but the faint glimmer of something that might one day become belonging. The first time Clara stepped beyond the cabin door, the morning air struck her like a baptism. It was sharp with pine and cold enough to sting her lungs, but it carried a sweetness too, a promise that each breath mattered. She clutched the cane James had carved from a sturdy branch, leaning heavily on it as she eased herself down the single step. James walked beside her, neither hovering nor distant. The more you move, the faster that leg will heal, he said, nodding toward the open ground. The land won't wait for you to be ready. Out here, it never does. Clara looked across the expanse stretching from the tree line to the horizon. Waves of prairie grass shimmered in gold beneath the early sun, broken only by the dark lines of cottonwoods following a hidden creek. Beyond them rose the distant mountains, blue and solemn as ancient sentinels. It was unlike anything she had ever known in Boston, where brick and cobblestone hemmed in the sky. It feels, she paused, searching for words, endless, as if the world just keeps breathing out, farther and farther. James gave a low chuckle. Some call it freedom, others call it loneliness. Depends on what you're carrying inside. They walked slowly toward the edge of the clearing. A hawk circled high above, its cry slicing the silence. Clara steadied herself against the cane, her leg aching but tolerable. For the first time since the attack, the pain did not define her. James bent to examine a line of tracks near the grass. Elk passed here last night. Could be meat for the week if I find them again. He straightened, his eyes sweeping the land with practiced familiarity. This place doesn't give without asking something back. You take a harvest, you mend a fence. You cut timber, you plant more. It's a bargain every settler learns. Clara thought of the Homestead Act she had read about in Boston newspapers, the promise of land to those brave enough to claim it, the dream of building something permanent on soil wrestled from wilderness. She remembered her father once saying that roots were not planted in the ground, but in the heart. Looking at the broad sweep of prairie, she felt for the first time that her heart might find soil here. I came west to teach, she said softly, but now I wonder if God meant me for more than a schoolhouse, perhaps for a life, planted. James studied her profile, the determination etched there despite her pallor. Planted things grow, he said after a moment, if they're tended. She turned to him, startled by the gentleness beneath his words. For all his rough exterior, this man who had seen battle and loss still believed in tending, in nurturing. That realization tightened something inside her, not in fear, but in longing. The wind rose, rippling through the grass like a hymn sung in a tongue older than words. Clara closed her eyes and let it wash over her. She had been adrift for so long, a soul without anchor. Now, standing on this raw, demanding land with James beside her, she felt a stirring deeper than survival, not merely to endure, but to belong. The third week of Clara's recovery brought an unexpected visitor. She was sitting by the cabin window, sewing clumsy stitches into a torn sleeve, when the steady beat of hoofbeats echoed through the pines. James set aside the axe he had been sharpening and reached for his rifle. The tension in his shoulders was instinctive, born from years of law enforcement and older memories still raw. The rider who emerged from the tree line was tall and broad, his gray mustache catching the light. Dust clung to his coat, but the badge pinned to his chest shone unmistakably. Clara leaned forward as James's expression shifted from wariness to something that almost resembled relief. "Marshal Carter," James greeted, lowering the rifle. "Still quick on the draw, Caldwell," the marshal replied with a dry smile as he swung down from his horse. "Wouldn't expect less." They clasped hands firmly. Clara sensed history in the grip, the kind forged in places where survival depended on trust. "Miss Dawson," James said, gesturing toward her, "this is Marshal Elias Carter. We rode together once, back when the territories burned hotter than they do now." The marshal removed his hat and gave her a courteous nod. "Ma'am, I'm glad to see you breathing. When I heard what happened on the Silverton stage, I feared there'd be no survivors." Clara's fingers tightened on the fabric in her lap. "There were none but me," she admitted. Her voice trembled with the memory of blood pooling in the dust, of bodies left behind. Elias's gaze softened. "You're not safe yet. The man behind that ambush, Silas Blackthorne, he doesn't leave business unfinished. Word is, he's hunting for you." The room seemed to tilt. Clara gripped the chair's armrest. "He wants me dead." James's jaw clenched. "He wants silence. A witness is the one thing he can't afford." The marshal nodded grimly. "He's struck before, across Montana and Wyoming. Always stagecoaches, always swift and merciless. He's carved a trail of blood wide enough to shame any outlaw I've chased." "And now," he paused, his eyes flicking toward James, "now he knows you're involved." Clara turned to James. "Why would that matter?" For a moment, silence pressed thick between them. James stared into the fire, as though the flames might swallow the truth. Finally, he exhaled, heavy and reluctant. "Because I believe Blackthorne was there the night my wife and daughter died," he said quietly. 8 years ago. Different town, different stagecoach, same method, same cruelty." The air in the cabin chilled, though the fire still burned. Clara's breath caught at the rawness in his voice, at the grief that had lain hidden beneath his steadiness. Elias broke the silence. "I can't prove it yet, but Caldwell's right to suspect. Blackthorne doesn't just steal, he takes lives like trophies. And if he's after Miss Dawson, then this isn't just survival, it's justice waiting to be done." Clara looked from one man to the other, her heart pounding. She had thought her suffering ended the day James found her beneath the cottonwood. Now she understood. Her presence here was a spark in an old fire, one that could consume them both. For the first time since her escape, she wondered not if she would live, but whether she had led danger straight to the only man who had shown her mercy. Night settled heavy over the cabin, stars piercing through the dark like watchful eyes. James spread a hand-drawn map across the table, its edges frayed from years of use. Elias leaned over it, tracing the routes with a weathered finger. "Blackthorne's men were spotted near Copper Creek 2 nights ago," the marshal said. "If he's smart, and he is, he won't linger. Once he senses lawmen closing in, he'll vanish into the hills." James nodded grimly. "Then we strike before he moves. We'll need men, supplies, and a plan that doesn't leave Clara exposed." "I'm right here, Sheriff Caldwell," Clara interjected, her voice sharper than she intended. She sat straighter in the chair, pale but resolute. "If you're speaking of me, don't speak around me." Both men turned toward her. James's expression hardened, the sheriff's mask slipping into place. "This isn't a debate, Clara. You've been shot, Clara. You're barely walking. You'll stay where it's safe." Her heart thudded, but she didn't waver. "Safe? There's no safe place while that man still breathes. You said it yourself. He wants me silenced. If I'm the only witness who can identify him, then you need me." Elias's mustache twitched, the ghost of a grin. "She has a point, James." James shot him a glare, but Clara pressed on. "I'm tired of running, tired of hiding while others bleed. Those people on the stagecoach, they deserve justice, and I mean to see it given." For a long moment, only the fire popped between them. James braced his hands on the table, knuckles white. Every instinct screamed to shield her, to bar the door and face the danger alone. Yet he saw the determination in her eyes, the steel beneath her gentleness. "Do you even know what you're asking?" he demanded, his voice low. "Blackthorn is no common thief. He'll kill anyone in his path." Clara's gaze didn't falter. "Then let me stand in his path. I won't lift a gun if you forbid it, but I will stand as witness." Silence stretched again until Elias cleared his throat. "We don't have time for endless arguing. By dawn he could be gone. We ride at first light." James dragged a hand over his face, torn between fury and fear. Finally, he sank into the chair across from Clara. His voice dropped, raw. "You don't understand what it would do to me if you were taken too. I couldn't bear." He stopped, the words strangled in his throat. Clara reached across the table, her fingers brushing his scarred hand. "I'm not asking to be reckless, James. I'm asking to be brave. And I don't believe God spared me beneath that cottonwood just so I could cower in a cabin." Her voice softened as she added, almost a whisper, "His grace is sufficient for me. His power is made perfect in weakness." The verse hung in the room like a bomb, heavier than any argument. James stared at her, storm-gray eyes torn between protest and surrender. Finally, with a weary exhale, he nodded once. "Then we do this together. But you follow my orders, Clara Dawson, every one of them. Promise me that much." "I promise," she said, and for the first time, fear loosened its grip on her heart. The journey into Willow Creek took most of the day. Clara rode astride a gentle mare borrowed from James, her cane strapped to the saddle. The rhythm of the horse's gait jarred her injured leg, but she refused to complain. James rode close on one side, Marshal Carter on the other, their eyes ever watchful as the trail wound through hills scarred by old mining diggings. By late afternoon, the town appeared in the valley below, a ribbon of wooden buildings along a single muddy street. A church steeple rose modestly above the rooftops, its white paint weathered but still bright against the mountains. From the belfry, a bell tolled the hour, the sound carrying across the prairie like a call to gather. Clara's chest tightened. Boston's bells had always rung heavy with formality. This one was different, humble, insistent, a heartbeat for the scattered homesteads that depended on the town. As they rode down the main street, heads turned. Shopkeepers paused in their doorways. Women carrying baskets stopped mid-step. Children darted from alleys to stare wide-eyed at the strangers. Clara felt their gazes settle on her, on the pale woman in borrowed clothes with hair pinned hastily back. Whispers rippled, curiosity sharpened by caution. James dismounted in front of the sheriff's office, his posture commanding. "Afternoon," he called evenly, tipping his hat toward the small crowd. The townsfolk nodded, some with respect, others with wariness. A boy of about 10 tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mama, is that the lady from the stagecoach?" he whispered loudly enough for Clara to hear. The woman hushed him, but her eyes lingered on Clara with something softer than suspicion. Pity, perhaps, or recognition of pain. Marshal Carter greeted the deputies waiting outside, then turned to introduce Clara formally. "Miss Dawson survived what none of us should. She carries truth that could bring Blackthorn down." The murmurs grew louder, shifting in tone. Clara met the stares as best she could, refusing to shrink back. She wanted them to see not just a victim, but a woman standing despite wounds. Later, James guided her across the street to the small white church. Inside, the air smelled of pine and lamp oil. A blackboard leaned against one wall, chalk scrawls of numbers and letters from a recent lesson still visible. Clara traced the faded writing with her fingertips, imagining children's voices reciting verses, the scrape of boots on the wooden floor. "School doubles as church," James explained quietly. "Preacher comes twice a month. The rest of the time, Miss Harper teaches the children." Clara turned, her eyes shining despite exhaustion. This is what I dreamed of. Not Boston's marble halls. Here, where every word matters, where lessons might mean the difference between hope and despair. James watched her, something unspoken tightening in his throat. He had brought her to town to face danger, yet she was looking at the worn benches and seeing a home. Outside, the bell rang again, calling the faithful to evening prayer. Clara closed her eyes, listening. For the first time since the stagecoach attack, she felt not hunted, but drawn forward. Perhaps God had not only spared her life, perhaps he was planting her where she was meant to grow. The sheriff's office smelled of ink, dust, and gun oil. A lantern burned low on the desk where Elias spread out a larger, more detailed map than the one James kept at his cabin. Red pencil marks traced stage routes and abandoned mining camps. The inked veins of silver, once chased by fortune seekers, now little more than outlaw refuges. "Blackthorn's holed up here," Elias said, tapping a spot in the foothills west of town. "Old Silver Ridge Camp, fortified ground. If we rush him straight on, we'll be cut down before we clear the trail." James leaned over the desk, arms braced, his eyes narrowing. "We'll need 2 flanks. Draw him out while another team cuts off escape." Clara hovered near the back, listening intently. She had spent the afternoon studying the maps pinned along the office wall, her mind tracing routes as though arranging puzzle pieces. Now she stepped closer, her voice quiet but steady. "There's a pass here." She pointed to a narrow gap between 2 ridges. "Stagecoaches used it when the main road flooded last spring. If men came from this direction, they could reach the rear of the camp unseen." Elias straightened, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You're certain?" "I memorized routes before I traveled west," Clara explained, her cheeks coloring under their scrutiny. "My father taught me to never sit on a coach without knowing where it led." James exchanged a glance with Elias. Respect, reluctant and unmistakable, glinted there. "She's right," he said. "It could work." The marshal nodded. "Then it's settled. We split forces at dawn." The plan in place, the deputies dispersed to prepare. Clara found herself outside with James, the evening air cool and tinged with wood smoke from hearths across Willow Creek. The town had grown quiet, lanterns blowing like fireflies against the darkness. "You surprised them in there," James said at last. "Surprised you, too, I think," she replied, unable to keep the faint smile from her lips. His answering smile was weary but genuine. "I've been underestimating you." His voice dropped, softer than she'd ever heard it. "Truth is, I keep seeing you as someone I need to protect. But tonight I saw the woman who saved herself, who's saving me in ways I can't explain." Clara's breath caught. She searched his face, half expecting him to retreat behind the walls he carried so carefully. Instead, his storm-gray eyes held steady, raw and unguarded. "I thought my heart was buried with Sarah and Emma," he admitted, his words rough with pain and honesty. "But since the night I found you under that cottonwood, it's been beating differently. I feel alive again." The world seemed to still around them, the hush of prairie wind, the faint creak of the wooden boardwalk, the glow of starlight above. Clara stepped closer, her hand brushing his sleeve. "You've given me more than life, James," she whispered. "You've given me belonging." For a heartbeat, they hovered in silence. Then James lowered his head, hesitant, as though asking permission. Clara rose onto her toes, closing the space between them. Their lips met gently, tentative yet certain, carrying all the fear and hope neither had dared to voice. When they parted, James's hand lingered at her cheek. "Tomorrow we face Blackthorn," he murmured. "But tonight I remember what it means to hope." Clara pressed her forehead to his, eyes closing against the swell of emotion. For the first time, she welcomed the dawn, not with dread, but with the fragile courage born of love. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Dawn crept across the foothills in a thin veil of mist, painting the abandoned mining camp in ghostly hues. The sagging cabins and the black mouth of the mine shaft loomed like ruins of some forgotten war. From the ridge above, Clara crouched behind a jagged boulder, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering so loudly she feared the outlaws might hear it. James knelt beside her, rifle cradled against his shoulder. His profile was stone-carved in the pale light, every line sharpened by resolve. Below, Marshal Carter and Deputy Isaiah moved into position, creeping between piles of broken timbers. On the opposite ridge, Cooper and Mitch circled wide, their silhouettes mere shadows against the rising sun. Then, silence shattered. A rifle cracked from within the camp, the shot ringing like thunder against the cliffs. Sparks flew from the ore cart shielding Carter. Almost instantly, gunfire erupted from every corner of the camp, muzzle flashes sparking like fireflies in the gloom. Bullets shrieked past, biting stone, spitting dust. The smell of powder thickened the air. Clara pressed against the rock, her fingers clutching the derringer in her pocket. Her body trembled, not only from fear, but from the brutal realization that there was no turning back. James had told her this was war, and now she understood. This was the moment where lives balanced on the edge of lead and faith. James returned fire, his Winchester booming steady and controlled. "Stay low," he barked over the roar. His tone carried no room for argument, only the grim cadence of survival. Clara nodded, her throat too tight for words. She forced herself to breathe, slow, even, deliberate. The psalm her mother once whispered returned to her, unbidden. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." Another volley tore through the ridge, fragments of stone stinging her cheek. Clara closed her eyes for a heartbeat, whispering the words into the dust. She did not pray for safety, she prayed for courage. Below, the scene dissolved into chaos. One deputy's shot felled an outlaw rushing for the corral. Another outlaw fired from a cabin window, glass exploding in shards. Horses screamed in panic, rearing against their tethers. The old mine itself seemed to groan, its timbers echoing with the thunder of combat. James reloaded swiftly, movements precise despite the storm around them. His voice reached her again, low but fierce. "This ends today. Blackthorn's run long enough." Clara turned her head, studying him in the fractured light. Even with death spitting fire around them, his resolve never wavered. She realized, with a clarity sharp as the crack of rifles, that this was not only his battle, it was theirs. Her survival, his redemption, bound together in the valley below. She tightened her grip on the derringer. She was not ready to fire it, not yet. But the weight in her palm reminded her she was no longer just a hunted woman. She was a witness, a voice, a thread of hope in a world splintering with violence. And with each prayer whispered against the roar of guns, she vowed she would not let fear silence her. The air thickened with smoke and screams. Shots ricocheted off rock and timber, each report rolling across the hills like thunder. From her cover, Clara watched one outlaw fall, clutching his chest, his body kicking up a cloud of dust as he collapsed. A second outlaw tried to bolt for the horses, but Deputy Mitch's rifle barked from the western ridge. The man pitched forward, his blood soaking into the dry earth. For a breathless instant, it seemed the fight might already be turning. Then the door of the largest cabin slammed open. Silas Blackthorn stepped into the dawn. Tall, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a black duster that whipped in the wind, he carried himself like a man who believed the world itself owed him passage. His face was carved with harsh lines, his dark eyes glittering with contempt. A long-barreled Colt rested easy in his hand, the weapon of a killer who had never missed sleep over a corpse. The moment he appeared, the battle changed. His voice, deep and mocking, cut through the chaos. You think a handful of lawmen can bleed me out? I've outlived better than you." He raised his pistol and fired. The shot struck the ore cart where Marshal Carter crouched, sparks leaping as metal screamed. Blackthorn didn't flinch, didn't rush. He moved with terrifying calm, each step deliberate, each shot measured. James fired back, the crack of his Winchester echoing across the ridge. Blackthorn ducked behind a water trough, then rolled clear, returning fire with deadly precision. Clara flinched as a bullet smacked into the boulder above her head, showering her with grit. Then James grunted, a sharp, guttural sound that ripped through the gunfire. Clara turned in time to see him stagger back, his rifle slipping from his grip. His left shoulder bloomed red, the fabric darkening with fresh blood. "James!" The cry tore from her throat before she could stop it. He clenched his jaw, forcing himself upright, his revolver already in his other hand. "Stay down!" he barked, his voice rough with pain. But Clara saw it, the falter in his step, the tremor in his arm. For the first time since she had met him, James Caldwell looked mortal, fragile beneath the storm-gray strength of his eyes. Blackthorn's laughter rolled across the camp like a predator savoring its kill. "Sheriff Caldwell," he sneered, his voice thick with triumph. "I've heard of you, the lawman who lost his family while he polished his badge. Tell me, will this woman die screaming, same as they did?" The words sliced through Clara sharper than any bullet. She felt James stiffen, his fury sparking like a forge, but his body betrayed him, blood soaking through his sleeve, his movements slower, heavier. Marshal Carter shouted orders from below, his deputies pressing the attack, but Clara barely heard them. All her senses locked onto the two men, James wounded, still standing, and Silas Blackthorn, a shadow from his past, alive with venom and power. The battle had narrowed to this. Every breath, every heartbeat, every prayer whispered in Clara's chest bent toward the inevitable collision of the lawman and the outlaw, and she knew, with a cold certainty that stole her breath, that James might not survive it. Clara's lungs burned with each breath, her body pressed hard against the stone. James fought on below, his left arm hanging useless, blood dripping into the dust. Silas Blackthorn advanced with predator's ease, his revolver steady, his grin cruel. Something inside Clara broke. She could not stay hidden, not while James bled, not while this man, the very shadow of evil, closed in. Her fingers closed around the small derringer James had pressed into her hand days ago. The weapon felt fragile, absurdly small against Blackthorn's Colt, yet its weight steadied her. She rose from behind the rock. The world seemed to narrow into silence. Gunfire echoed faintly elsewhere in the camp, but here, in this breathless stretch of earth between them, only two figures mattered. A wounded sheriff struggling to stay upright, and a woman stepping into destiny. "Drop it!" Clara's voice cracked, but the steel in it surprised even her. She leveled the derringer, both hands trembling yet unyielding. "Step away from him, Blackthorn." The outlaw froze mid-step. Then he turned, slow and deliberate, until his gaze locked with hers. He laughed, low and dark, a sound like gravel in a coffin. "Well now," he drawled, "the little dove found her claws. Do you think that toy will save him, or you?" He lifted his revolver, not at her, but at James, who swayed on his feet, his jaw set against pain. Clara took one step closer, her heart pounding so violently she feared it might split her chest. "Try me," she said, though her voice shook. "At this range, I won't miss." For a flicker, doubt shadowed Blackthorn's eyes. He was a killer, but he was no fool. A single well-placed shot, even from a small pistol, could end him. Clara's knees threatened to buckle, but she drew strength not from the weapon in her hands, but from the verse echoing within her, steady as a heartbeat. And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. Was this His purpose? To place her, trembling yet unbroken, between darkness and the man who had risked everything for her?
Blackthorn sneered, masking the flicker of unease. "You've got fire, girl, but fire burns out. When it does, you'll wish you'd begged." Clara tightened her grip, her finger brushing the trigger. "I will never beg you," she said firmly. "Not now, not ever." Behind her, James rasped her name, a warning, a plea. But Clara did not waver. The fear that had hunted her across the prairie, that had clawed at her in nightmares, no longer ruled her. She stood with nothing but a small pistol, a whispered verse, and the unshakable conviction that Providence had not spared her to cower. Silas tilted his head, weighing her courage against his cruelty. For a suspended moment, time itself seemed to hold its breath, the world balanced on the pull of a single trigger. And then chaos erupted again. The standoff shattered in an instant. Silas's gaze darted toward Clara, then back to James, reading the hesitation in both. His grin widened, vicious and certain. He shifted his revolver towards James's chest, calm, deliberate, a predator savoring the kill. "Time to finish what I started 8 years ago," he sneered. James moved. With a roar torn from somewhere deeper than pain, he lunged, slamming into Silas before the outlaw could fire. The gunshot exploded skyward, harmless, echoing through the ridges. Clara gasped as both men crashed to the ground in a tangle of fists, steel and fury. The derringer shook in her hands, but she dared not fire. The men rolled across the rocky slope, James striking with his good arm, Silas snarling like a beast cornered. Dust rose around them in choking clouds. Silas's knife flashed, drawn from his boot. He slashed wildly, the blade grazing James's forearm, leaving a bloody streak. James grunted, his grip slipping for a breathless moment. Silas surged up, pressing the blade toward James's throat. "Die knowing I took everything from you," Silas spat. His face twisted with triumph, the madness of a man who had killed too often to count. "Not this time," James rasped, straining, his muscles trembling with exertion. With one final heave, he drove his shoulder into Silas, twisting their bodies. They tumbled. Clara screamed as the two men pitched over the ridge's edge, tumbling down the rocky slope in a blur of limbs and dust. The sound of their bodies striking stone echoed like drumbeats of doom until, at last, they came to rest in a heap at the base. Her breath tore ragged from her lungs. She scrambled down the slope, heedless of her injured leg, scraping her palms raw against jagged rock. The derringer clattered forgotten from her hand as she half slid, half stumbled to the bottom. Silas lay twisted against a boulder, his neck bent an unnatural angle, eyes wide and glassy with the shock of sudden death. The black duster that had made him a figure of terror now draped like a shroud over broken bones. The outlaw was finished. But James... Clara fell to her knees beside him. Blood matted his dark hair where his temple had struck stone. His chest rose shallow, uneven, each breath a battle. The wound in his shoulder bled freely, staining the dust beneath him a dark crimson. "James," she choked, pressing trembling fingers to his throat. For a horrible moment she felt nothing. Then, faint, so faint, his pulse throbbed weakly against her touch. Relief surged, fierce and desperate. "He's alive," she whispered to no one, to the heavens, to God himself. "Please, Lord, keep him alive!" Above them, the gunfire dwindled as deputies secured the camp. Marshal Carter's voice called down, urgent, but Clara scarcely heard. Her world had narrowed to the man sprawled in her arms, his lifeblood seeping away even as her prayers spilled over him like a flood. Silas Blackthorn was dead, but victory felt like ashes while James Caldwell lay broken in her embrace. The camp fell eerily quiet once the last outlaw was dragged from hiding. Gun smoke lingered in the air, acrid and heavy, but the chaos had ebbed. For Clara, it was as if the world had narrowed to a single heartbeat, the faint, uneven thrum beneath her fingers as she clung to James. Marshal Carter and Isaiah scrambled down the slope. One look at Silas's broken body told them all they needed. But their eyes went quickly to James. "Alive?" Carter barked. "Barely," Clara gasped, her hands already pressing against the wound in James's shoulder, blood soaking her skirts. "We have to move him now." Working together, the men fashioned a makeshift travaux from timber and torn canvas. They lifted James gently, every groan he made cutting into Clara like a blade.
She walked beside him as they hauled the travois up the ridge and toward the waiting horses. The ride to Willow Creek blurred into a desperate rush. Hooves thundered across hard ground, dust rising behind them like storm clouds. Clara rode close to the travois, one hand clutching the side, the other grasping James's limp hand. His skin was fever-hot, his breath ragged. She whispered constantly, half prayer, half plea. "Hold on, James. Please hold on. You promised I wouldn't face pain alone. Don't break that promise now." By the time they reached Willow Creek, townsfolk were gathering in the street, faces pale at the sight of blood. Dr. Howard Bennett shoved through the crowd, his gray hair wild, his eyes sharp. "Bring him inside," the doctor ordered. "Clear my table." Inside the clinic, they laid James on a narrow cot. Bennett's hands worked swiftly, cutting away cloth, examining the wounds with practiced efficiency. Bullet lodged deep in the shoulder. Head trauma. Broken ribs, most likely. He's lost too much blood. "I'm staying," Clara said firmly, moving to the wash basin without waiting for permission. Bennett glanced at her, measuring her resolve.
"You know anything about medicine? My father was a physician in Boston. I assisted him for years." She wrung out a cloth, her voice trembling but steady. "Tell me what to do." The doctor gave a curt nod. "Then help me keep him alive." Hours bled into night. Clara worked at Bennett's side, holding instruments, mopping blood, whispering encouragement even when James lay still as stone. Once, his eyes flickered open, unfocused, and his lips formed her name before slipping back into unconsciousness. The sound was both agony and hope. When at last Bennett stepped back, sweat streaking his brow, he sighed heavily. "The bullet's out. Stitches are done. But it's in God's hands now." Clara sank onto the chair beside James, clasping his limp hand between both of hers. She bent her head close to his, her tears falling onto his skin. "You're not alone, James," she whispered fiercely. "I will sit here until you wake. I will talk until you hear me. I will pray until God Himself carries you back to me." The night deepened, silent save for the tick of the clock and the shallow rasp of James's breathing. Clara kept vigil, her voice a steady thread in the darkness. Stories of Boston, dreams of a schoolhouse, promises of tomorrow. Anything to call him back from the edge. The first light of dawn crept through the clinic window, pale and thin, falling across James's bandaged body. Clara had not moved from her chair. Her eyes were swollen from sleeplessness, her hand cramped from clutching his. Still she held fast, whispering soft words through the long hours when she feared he might slip away for good. Then his fingers twitched. Clara's head snapped up. For a heartbeat she thought it was her imagination, some cruel trick of hope. But then his hand squeezed hers, faint but deliberate. "James," she breathed, leaning close. His eyelids fluttered, then opened slowly, revealing storm-gray eyes dulled by pain but alive. His cracked lips formed her name. "Clara." A sob tore from her throat as relief crashed over her. She pressed her forehead to his hand, tears wetting his skin. "I'm here. You came back to me." He managed a weak smile, though every breath seemed to cost him. "Couldn't let you face it alone." Before she could answer, the door creaked open. Marshal Carter stepped in, his weathered face grave, his hat held low in his hands. He crossed to the bed and placed a small object on the nightstand.
Clara glanced down. A locket, its silver tarnished, its hinge dented. James's eyes fixed on it instantly, his breath caught. With trembling fingers, he reached for it, flipping it open. Inside, beneath the cracked glass, was the miniature portrait of a woman and a little girl. His wife, his daughter. The sheriff's face crumpled, his jaw clenched, but the tears came anyway, sliding down his temples into his hair. For 8 years he had carried the weight of vengeance, the gnawing wound of not knowing. Now the truth lay before him, brutal and undeniable. "It was him," James whispered hoarsely. "All along. He killed them." Carter's voice was low but firm. "We found it in Blackthorn's pocket. He carried it like a trophy." Clara pressed her hand over James's, steadying the locket as though anchoring him. "He's gone, James. That chapter is finished. You don't have to carry it anymore." His chest rose and fell, each breath shuddering with grief and release.
"I thought if I could kill him, it would make me whole again." He closed his eyes, tears slipping free. "But it doesn't. It just hurts less now because I know the truth." Clara brushed the damp hair from his forehead, her voice trembling with tenderness. "It's not vengeance that heals, James. It's grace and love, and you still have both." He turned his head, meeting her gaze with raw vulnerability. "I almost lost the chance to tell you that I love you." "You don't need to say it," Clara whispered, though her heart soared. "But I want to hear it all the same." "I love you," he said again, firmer this time, though his strength was failing. She bent to press a kiss to his temple, her tears falling freely. "And I love you, always." Outside, the church bell rang morning prayer. Clara closed her eyes, whispering her own. Not for vengeance, but for thanksgiving. The outlaw who had cast such a long shadow was gone. The man she loved still breathed. And in that fragile dawn, love proved stronger than death, grief, or fear. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. James Caldwell's recovery was neither swift nor simple. For days after the battle, fever tugged him back and forth across the thin veil between this world and the next. Dr. Bennett came twice a day, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he checked the stitches in James's shoulder and the bandages around his ribs. "He's stubborn," the doctor said more than once, peering down at his patient with grudging admiration. "That'll keep him alive longer than most medicine I can give." Clara never left his side. She learned the rhythms of his labored breathing, the small signs that meant pain was rising or that sleep was slipping into fever. She cooled his burning skin with cloth soaked in water from the creek, spooned broth between his lips when he was strong enough to swallow, and whispered prayers over him when he seemed lost in dreams too dark to name. Sometimes he answered, his voice barely a rasp. Once, when the fever peaked, he murmured Sarah's name, his wife, taken years ago. Clara's heart clenched, but instead of jealousy, she felt only sorrow for a wound still healing. Another time, half delirious, he whispered hers, Clara. It was enough to bring her to tears. The town of Willow Creek did not turn away. Each day, neighbors came with food, firewood, or a word of encouragement. The church bell tolled not only for worship but for prayer, and more than one townsman told Clara that they had lifted James's name before the Lord that week. Deputy Atkins, once awkward and nervous, stepped into the role of lawman with surprising steadiness, patrolling the streets and assuring the town their sheriff would return in time. They looked to him, Clara realized one evening as she stood at the clinic window watching the townsfolk move quietly below. But they're looking to me, too, to keep hope alive until he wakes. When James's fever finally broke, the relief was almost overwhelming. He stirred in the early hours, his hand searching blindly across the sheets until it found hers. Clara clasped it, tears of gratitude filling her eyes. "You've been here," he whispered, his voice weak but certain.
"I'll always be here," she answered, her words steady as a vow. As the days turned to weeks, his strength grew in small increments. He could sit up for short spells, then walk a few halting steps across the room. Clara helped him with the simplest of tasks, from buttoning his shirt to shaving the stubborn stubble from his jaw. Each act of care became an intimacy, weaving them closer with threads stronger than words. The town rejoiced in his survival. Mrs. Wilson, the mayor's wife, brought a rocking chair for the cabin porch. The children of Willow Creek, their eyes wide with hero worship, slipped notes of thanks beneath the clinic door. And when Sunday came, the preacher offered a prayer of thanksgiving that filled the small church with solemn joy. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, when the clinic had emptied and the sun slanted warm across the bed, that Clara dared to speak of the future. "You once said titles don't mean much when you're bleeding," she began, smoothing the blanket over his chest. "But they mean something when you're healing. Sheriff, teacher, husband, wife, they're pieces of a life. Do you think we could have that here?" James turned his head to study her. His eyes, still shadowed by fatigue, softened with something deeper than gratitude. "I used to believe my life ended the night I lost them, that all that was left was duty. Then I found you under that cottonwood, and I realized God wasn't finished with me yet." Clara's breath caught. "You mean—" "I mean I want more than duty, Clara Dawson. I want a home again, and if you'll have me, I want it with you." Her heart swelled so full it nearly broke. She clasped his hand tightly, the answer plain in her tearful smile. The day James Caldwell left Dr. Bennett's clinic, the whole town seemed to pause. Children peeked around corners, shopkeepers leaned in their doorways, and even the blacksmith laid down his hammer to tip his cap. The sheriff was alive, carried not in triumph but in quiet resilience, leaning on Clara's steady arm as they made their way to the waiting wagon. Deputy Atkins held the reins, his chest puffed with pride, as though shepherding the return of a legend. Tied to the seat was a bundle wrapped in burlap, gifts from the townsfolk. Inside, Clara later discovered, were jars of preserves, a quilt stitched by the women of Willow Creek, and a small wooden cradle crafted by the carpenter's hand. The message was clear. They saw not only the sheriff restored, but a future for the woman beside him. As the wagon creaked out of town, James leaned back against the cushions, his face pale but his eyes bright. Clara drove, the reins steady in her hands, glancing often at him with a smile she could not contain. The road stretched wide before them, the hills rolling like waves toward the horizon. For the first time since her escape, Clara felt the land itself welcome her, no longer harsh wilderness, but the ground of her belonging. When they reached the cabin, she gasped. The porch had been swept clean, the windows polished until they caught the afternoon sun. A new rocking chair waited by the door. Smoke curled from the chimney, a fire lit by kind neighbors to greet their return. James eased himself down from the wagon, wincing at the pull in his ribs. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small box, worn smooth from years of being carried yet never opened. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Inside lay a gold band, plain save for the tiny diamond that caught the light. "I thought I'd never have cause to give it again, but then you came, Clara Dawson. And you gave me back not only my life, but my hope." Clara's breath trembled, tears welling as he took her hand. "I know it's sudden," James continued, "but I don't want to waste another day wondering. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Clara whispered, then louder, certain as the mountains behind them. "Yes, James Caldwell, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger, his hand shaking, not from weakness but from awe. When he leaned forward to kiss her, it was not the kiss of desperation they had shared before battle, but one of promise, a seal upon the life they were building. 2 weeks later, the church bell of Willow Creek rang not for mourning, nor for battle, but for joy. The townsfolk crowded into the small sanctuary, their voices lifting in hymns as Clara Dawson became Clara Caldwell. Marshal Carter stood as witness, Deputy Atkins as groomsman, the women of the town circling Clara with warmth and laughter. When the vows were spoken and James kissed his bride, Clara felt the weight of every hardship fall away. Here, before God and this frontier family, she had found her home. The seasons that followed were marked not by fear, but by growth.
Clara took up teaching in the church schoolhouse, her voice carrying lessons of letters and hope to children who might one day build a gentler West. James resumed his duties as sheriff, slower at first, but steadier than ever, his authority tempered by the humility of a man who had nearly lost everything. At night, they returned to the cabin, now their cabin, where the rocking chair creaked beneath James's strong frame and Clara read aloud by lamplight. They planned a garden, dreamed of children, and spoke often of grace, the kind that had spared them and the kind they would need for the years ahead. One evening, as the sun sank golden behind the peaks, Clara rested her head on James's shoulder and whispered, "Do you regret it, that the path was so hard?" James kissed her hair, his arm drawing her close. "No, because it brought me here, to you, to us, and that's more than I ever thought I'd be given again." The wind rustled through the pines, carrying with it the faint sound of the church bell from town. Clara closed her eyes, smiling. Whatever trials lay ahead, they would face them together, sheriff and schoolteacher, husband and wife, two hearts stitched back to wholeness by faith, love, and the wide, wild land that had become their forever home. As the final light fades over the Montana prairie, James and Clara's journey reminds us that the Wild West was never only about gunfights and dust. It was about hearts learning to trust again, about loss becoming the soil where love and faith could take root. Perhaps in their courage you see echoes of your own trials, the wounds you've carried, the nights you've prayed for strength, the hope you've held on to even when the road seemed too long. Their story is more than fiction. It's a mirror of the resilience and compassion that still live in us today. And maybe, like Clara, you too have learned that grace is found not in escape, but in standing firm, hand in hand, through the storm. If this tale touched your heart, join us as we continue sharing true Wild West stories, tales of grit, grace, and love that still speak to us across the ages.